every governance initiative your organization has completed for Microsoft 365 may be actively undermining the next one. I know that sounds counterintuitive. You invested in access controls. You built retention policies. You rolled out training. Each project met its objectives and closed on time. But the platform is still harder to manage than it should be. Users are still building workarounds, and every audit still turns up gaps nobody anticipated. The problem is not that your governance efforts failed individually. The problem is that they succeeded in isolation, and isolation is where governance goes to quietly fall apart. Here's what this pattern looks like in practice. The security team implements conditional access policies and tightens external sharing. Those controls are technically sound, but they were designed without input from the teams that depend on external collaboration for client delivery. So project managers start routing files through personal OneDrive accounts or third-party tools that sit completely outside the governance perimeter. The compliance team deploys retention labels and audit logging, but the information architecture underneath has drifted enough that labels get applied inconsistently and audit logs generate noise instead of signal. IT automates site provisioning to reduce sprawl, but the templates do not reflect how business units actually structure their work. So teams request exceptions faster than the provisioning system can process them. Training rolls out to explain the new tools, but the training was built around feature adoption, not around the governance guardrails those features are supposed to operate within. So trained users are more active on the platform and more active in creating ungoverned content, ungoverned sites, and ungoverned sharing patterns. Each of these efforts addressed a real requirement. None of them failed on their own terms, but they were designed, funded, and executed as separate projects with separate timelines, separate stakeholders, and no structural mechanism to ensure they reinforced each other. That is the governance pattern most organizations are running. 6 reasonable decisions that produce an unreasonable outcome. And the dysfunction compounds. Every quarter that these pillars operate independently, the gap between what the governance system is supposed to do and what it actually does gets wider. Remediation gets more expensive, and your Microsoft 365 investment delivers less than it should. That gap would be bad enough on its own, but the pressure is coming from every direction at once. Regulatory requirements are expanding across industries simultaneously. Distributed work models are permanent, not experimental, and cybersecurity threats increasingly target exactly this kind of fragmented governance. Environments where access controls, compliance enforcement, and user behavior operate on different assumptions. The fix is not more governance projects. The fix is restructuring the governance approach so that 6 pillars, access controls, content management, provisioning compliance, technical standards, and training, operate as a single coordinated system instead of independent work streams. Here is how that system works in practice. First, access and permissions become the security foundation that every other pillar builds on, not a standalone policy set. Access decisions are informed by content organization, shaped by compliance requirements, embedded in provisioning templates, and reinforced through training. When access controls are designed in coordination with the rest of the governance system, they can be precise enough to protect sensitive content without being so restrictive that users route around them. Second, content management and site provisioning are treated as 2 halves of the same structural problem. Content organization defines how information is classified, retained, and surfaced. Provisioning defines how collaboration spaces are created, configured, and governed. When these 2 pillars operate independently, you get well-provisioned sites filled with ungoverned content, or well-organized content trapped in sites that do not match how the business works. When they operate together, every new workspace inherits the right information architecture from the start. Third, compliance becomes embedded infrastructure rather than a parallel bureaucracy. Retention policies, classification labels, audit logging, and data loss prevention are wired into the provisioning and content management systems that users interact with daily. Compliance requirements shape the environment users work in, not a separate set of rules they are expected to remember and follow manually. Fourth, technical standards and user training close the system. Technical standards ensure that every governance mechanism performs reliably at scale, that monitoring catches configuration drift before it creates exposure, and that the platform infrastructure supports the governance model rather than working against it. Training shapes the user's capability to operate effectively within the governed environment, not feature training disconnected from governance context, but role-specific development that connects platform skills to the guardrails those skills depend on. The implementation sequence matters as much as the framework itself. We start with a full scope assessment across all 6 pillars to identify where the independencies are broken, where individual pillars have gaps, and establish foundational controls and stakeholder alignment. The next phase deploys the integrated governance capabilities: access management, content organization, provisioning and compliance automation, technical baselines, and role-based training as coordinated work streams rather than sequential projects. From there, we layer in automation, analytics, and optimization that make the system self-reinforcing over time. The final phase is what makes it stick: continuous monitoring, regular optimization, and structured adoption of new platform capabilities so the governance framework evolves instead of becoming the next thing that drifts. After nearly 30 years of integrating Microsoft systems for mid to large enterprises in regulated industries, we have built these governance frameworks as unified systems from the start. We do not bolt pillars together after the fact. The full blog post with the detailed 6-pillar framework, the 4-phase implementation roadmap, and specific integration points between each governance area is linked in the description. If you are running governance as 6 separate projects, that is where the structural fix starts. Governance that works in isolation eventually stops working entirely. Governance that works as a system is the only kind worth building.